The wine glass shattered before anyone understood what had happened. 1 second it was whole, crystal, expensive, the kind restaurants keep behind glass when they are not being used. And the next it was nothing. Fragments across white linen, red wine bleeding into the tablecloth like something living, and in the center of all of it, a man sitting perfectly still, his hand open, his expression unreadable, the way water is unreadable right before it pulls you under. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. The restaurant had gone completely silent, and in that silence something ancient and dangerous seemed to fill every corner of the room. The other diners did not look away. They did not pretend. They simply froze, the way animals freeze when they sense a predator they cannot name. The woman across the table had not flinched. She sat with her spine straight, her hands now folded in her lap, her eyes on the man in front of her with an expression that was not fear, not quite, but something more complicated than that, something that looked almost like grief. His name was Kenji Mori, and the man who had touched her hand would regret it for the rest of his life. Welcome to a story about possession, pride, and the unbearable cost of loving someone too quietly, for too long. If you have ever watched someone you love slip through your hands because you believed they already knew, this one is for you. Stay with us. And if you are new here, consider subscribing. The stories we tell on this channel have a way of staying with you. Kenji Mori was not born into the world the way most men describe their beginnings. He did not talk about his childhood with warmth. He did not speak of it at all, actually. Not to business partners, not to journalists, not to the handful of people who had tried over the years to get close enough to call themselves his friends. What was known about him was assembled from fragments, a name in court documents that never became a conviction, a photograph in a business magazine that showed a man in a dark suit looking at the camera as if he were deciding something about it, the quiet way certain rooms changed their temperature when he walked in. He had been running the Mori syndicate for 11 years by the time he met Yuna Ishida. He had inherited it the way some people inherit debts, abruptly, without preparation, at a moment when grief and responsibility arrived in the same breath. He was 26 years old when his father died, and he spent exactly 3 days mourning before he understood that mourning was a luxury that the organization could not afford. He put it somewhere inside himself. He kept moving. What he built in those 11 years was not a criminal empire in the dramatic sense that people imagine when they hear the word. It was quieter than that. A network of restaurants, construction interests, private security firms, entertainment venues spread across Osaka and Tokyo, and parts of the coast that people called beautiful when they visited, but never fully understood. The money moved through clean channels. The power expressed itself in favors, not force, at least not often. Kenji ran the Mori operation the way a surgeon runs a procedure, precise, unhurried, never more visible than necessary. He was not cruel. That is important to understand. He was not the kind of man who enjoyed fear. He was instead a man who had learned that fear was sometimes the only language that certain situations spoke fluently, and so he had become fluent in return. It was a tool, nothing more. But none of that explains Yuna. Yuna Ishida was the director of cultural programming at the Mori Foundation, the public-facing philanthropic arm that Kenji's father had established decades earlier as a gesture toward legitimacy, and that Kenji had quietly expanded into something real. It funded arts programs in underfunded schools, preservation of traditional textile practices in rural districts, community performances that traveled to places where culture rarely arrived. It was, in a very specific way, the only part of Kenji's world that he had built for no strategic reason at all. He had expanded it because he believed in it, because he had watched his mother perform at one of those community events as a child and understood for the first time that beauty was not something reserved for people with money. Yuna had been hired 3 years before the night of the shattered glass. She had arrived with a portfolio of work from a non-profit in Kyoto, a reputation for being both diplomatic and immovable when it came to the things she cared about, and a habit of speaking to Kenji with a directness that most of his employees spent years trying to learn and never quite managed. She disagreed with him in meetings. She sent him memos with questions embedded in them that were clearly arguments in disguise. She rearranged budget allocations and then explained why, with such precise logic, that he found himself unable to argue back, though he tried more than once simply out of principle. He did not know exactly when he stopped trying. What he knew was that he looked forward to their Tuesday briefings in a way he had not looked forward to anything in years. That he read her program reports on the same evening they arrived, which was not something he did with any other department. That when she laughed, which she did rarely and entirely without performance, the sound of it disrupted his concentration in a way that annoyed him considerably, and that he did nothing to stop. He had not told her any of this. He was Kenji Mori. He did not tell people things about himself. He showed them eventually in gestures that he calculated to be unambiguous, but that he would come to understand far too late were actually invisible to the person they were intended for. The dinner had been organized as a year-end gathering for the Foundation's advisory board. 12 people at a long table in a private room at Nakamura, one of Osaka's finest restaurants, where the lighting was amber and warm, and the silence between courses felt intentional rather than empty. Kenji sat at the head of the table. Yuna sat 4 places to his left, between an elderly architect named Fujimoto, who had designed the Foundation's first permanent space, and a man Kenji did not know well, a cultural consultant named Ryo Tanaka, who had been brought onto the board 6 months earlier at Yuna's recommendation. Tanaka was 34. He had the kind of ease in social situations that Kenji had always found slightly suspicious, the way he moved through a room as if it already liked him, the way he made eye contact with people just long enough to make them feel seen, but not long enough to make them uncomfortable. He was good-looking in an uncomplicated way. He laughed easily. He had over 6 months become someone Yuna clearly trusted, and Kenji had watched this with a stillness that he refused to examine too closely. The dinner moved through its courses. Conversations shifted and merged. Kenji spoke when necessary, listened more than he spoke, and watched Yuna from 4 seats away with a discipline that he told himself was neutral. It was not neutral. She was animated that evening in a way he recognized, the way she got when a program was going well, when the work was producing something she had believed in from the beginning. She was describing a textile exhibition that would travel to 3 rural schools in the spring, and her hands moved as she spoke, shaping the idea in the air, and Fujimoto was nodding with genuine pleasure, and Tanaka was leaning slightly toward her with an expression of focused attention that Kenji understood immediately and did not like. Then Tanaka said something. Kenji was too far to hear the words, and Yuna laughed that laugh, the one that was entirely without performance, and then Tanaka reached across and touched the back of her hand. Not provocatively, not romantically even, in any obvious sense. A gesture of shared amusement, quick and thoughtless and easy. The kind of touch that people exchange when they have spent enough time together that the space between them has softened. Kenji's hand closed around the wineglass. He did not plan it. He did not think, "I will break this." His fingers tightened around the stem with a pressure that had nothing to do with decision-making and everything to do with something that had been accumulating for 3 years without a release valve. The glass gave. It shattered with a clean, precise sound that cut through every conversation at the table simultaneously. The silence that followed was total. He looked down at his hand. There was a small cut on his palm, shallow, bleeding just enough to be visible. He picked up his linen napkin with perfect composure, pressed it to the cut, and said quietly, to no one in particular, "I apologize. The stem was flawed." Nobody questioned this. Nobody would. But Yuna was looking at him from 4 seats away with those eyes that missed nothing, and he knew, with a cold, sinking clarity, that she had understood exactly what the stem had not been. The dinner ended 40 minutes later. The board members said their goodbyes with the particular politeness of people who had witnessed something they were choosing not to name. Tanaka left with a handshake and a smile that was perfectly calibrated, and that Kenji returned with a nod that communicated nothing and everything. And then the room was nearly empty, and it was Kenji and Yuna and a staff member clearing the far end of the table. She waited until the staff member left. Then she said, "Your hand. It's fine." Kenji. She said his name the way she said everything, directly, without ornament. "It's not fine, and we both know it isn't about your hand." He looked at her. He had spent 3 years becoming very good at looking at her without letting her see what the looking cost him. He was not sure he was doing it well right now. "It was a reaction," he said. "It won't happen again." A reaction to what? She asked it genuinely, without accusation, which was somehow worse than if she had confronted him. She was trying to understand. She was giving him a door. "You went somewhere else for a moment. I could see it." He was quiet long enough that the silence itself became an answer. "Yuna," he said finally, and his voice was very careful, the way he made it careful when he was saying something important and did not want to say it incorrectly. "You are the most valuable person in this organization, not because of your competence, though your competence is extraordinary, because of the way you see things, the way you decide what matters." She waited. She knew there was more. "I should have said that differently. Earlier, long before tonight." She looked at him for a long moment. The amber light of the restaurant made everything slower, warmer, slightly suspended. Then she said, "How much earlier are we talking?" And something in his chest did something it had not done in years, shifted, cracked slightly along a seam he had not known was there. 3 years, he said, give or take. If you are still here, if this story is reaching you in some way, consider leaving a like. It helps more than you know, and keep watching, because what happened next is the part that changed everything. She did not say anything immediately. That was Yuna's way. She processed before she responded, which was one of the things that made her extraordinary at her work, and one of the things that made her, in this particular moment, almost unbearable to be near. Kenji had broken a wine glass with his bare hand and confessed in the only vocabulary he knew 3 years of something enormous, and she was sitting across from him processing it. Then she said, "You broke a wine glass." "Yes." "Because Rio touched my hand." "Yes." "Kenji." She pressed her lips together. He could not tell if she was about to say something painful or something he had been waiting 3 years to hear, and the not knowing was the most exposed he had felt since he was 26 years old, standing in a hospital corridor being told his father was gone. "I work for you. I've been careful not to read anything into anything because I work for you and because you are not someone who makes things easy to read." "I know. I didn't know if you saw me as anything other than—" "I know," he said again, quieter. "That is my failure, not yours." She looked at her hands for a moment, then back at him. "The memos," she said, and there was something slightly unsteady in her voice now, which was so rare that it hit him like a physical thing. "I always sent them in the evening when I knew you'd read them the same night, because I wanted to. I wanted to still be in the room with you somehow, even after I'd left for the day." He was very still. "I thought that was pathetic," she said. "I didn't let myself think about why I did it." "It wasn't pathetic. No, it was the best part of my evenings," he said, "for 3 years." The staff member returned, then immediately left again, reading the room with the professional instinct of someone who had spent years working in spaces where powerful people said important things. The door closed softly. Yuna exhaled. It was a long, careful breath, the kind that releases something that has been held at significant pressure for a significant amount of time. "I owe you an apology," Kenji said. "For the glass? For the glass. For the 3 years. For letting you believe that what you were to me was only professional. You deserved more clarity than I gave you." He paused. I am not easy with this. I'm aware of that." "You shattered a wine glass in front of 12 people," she said, and there was something that was almost, not quite but almost, a smile at the corner of her mouth. "I think that was fairly clear." He looked at her. "I will be clearer." She held his gaze. Something moved across her face. Not a decision exactly, but the completion of one she had already been building toward without naming it. "Then I suppose," she said carefully, "that I should tell you that I turned down an offer to lead a program in Kyoto last spring. A good offer, significant. I told myself it was because the Foundation's work here wasn't finished." He waited. "It wasn't because the Foundation's work wasn't finished," she said. The weight of that sentence settled into the room, like the last note of a piece of music that has been building for a very long time. Outside the restaurant, Osaka moved through its night, the city lights refracting off glass towers, the river catching the glow of the entertainment district, the ordinary noise of ordinary life proceeding at its ordinary pace. Inside, two people sat at a table strewn with the evidence of a broken wine glass and 3 years of careful, costly silence, and understood simultaneously that they had nearly lost something enormous to the habit of not saying the thing directly. But this is not where the story ends, because Kenji Mori was not a simple man, and the world he operated in was not a world that simply stepped aside when two people decided to stop lying to themselves. There were consequences to that shattered glass that neither of them had fully calculated yet, and there were people watching, people who were always watching, for whom that single unguarded gesture meant something very different than it meant to Yuna. Within the Mori organization, control was the primary currency. Not money, not territory, not influence, and control, the ability to be unreadable, the discipline of never showing your hand, never revealing what you valued, because what you valued became what someone else could threaten. Kenji had spent 11 years being a man without visible weakness, and in 45 seconds of lost composure over a wine glass, he had broadcast to everyone in that room exactly where his weakness lived. Takeda Hiroshi had been watching. Takeda was not a member of the Mori organization. He existed in the parallel space that such organizations always generate, adjacent, hungry, waiting for an opening. He ran a smaller, cruder operation out of the industrial port district, the kind of organization that survived by being useful to larger ones and positioned itself to grow whenever a larger one showed a crack. He had been waiting for a crack in the Mori structure for 8 years. He had the patience of someone who has nothing to lose and the cunning of someone who knows exactly what they are waiting for. He had not been at the dinner, but one of the advisory board members, a financial consultant named Ozawa, who had been quietly in Takeda's pocket for 2 years and Ozawa had a phone. And by 11 o'clock that evening, Takeda knew about the wine glass. He spent a week thinking about what to do with that information. In his world, a man's feelings for a woman were not interesting in themselves. What was interesting was leverage, and Kenji Mori, who had been leveraged by no one for 11 years, had just shown everyone in that room exactly where to press. What Takeda did was not dramatic at first. Dramatic was dangerous. Instead, he did something quiet. He reached out to Ryo Tanaka. Tanaka was not a criminal. He was not affiliated with Takeda's operation. He was, at his core, a perfectly decent man who worked in cultural consulting and genuinely respected Yuna's talent and had no idea what he had stepped into by simply existing at a dinner table in her proximity. Takeda's approach was not violent. It was informational. He simply made sure that Tanaka received, through an intermediary, a very clear and very specific suggestion that it would be in his professional interest to distance himself from the Mori Foundation, that certain questions were going to be asked about foundation funding in certain quarters, that his name should not be attached to those questions. It was a threat dressed as advice. Tanaka, to his credit, called Yuna immediately. She called Kenji the same night. He listened to her explain what had happened. His voice, when he responded, was very quiet, which she had already learned meant something entirely different from the quiet of other men. "Are you at home?" he asked. "Yes." "Stay there tonight. I will come in the morning and explain everything you need to know." She wanted to argue. She could feel the impulse to push back, to demand the explanation now, to refuse to be managed. But there was something in his voice that was not asking her to be passive. It was asking her to be safe, which was different. "All right," she said. After he hung up, he sat in his office for a long time. The cut on his palm had been cleaned and bandaged. He looked at it. One unguarded moment, 1 second of a grip that had more feeling in it than calculation. And now someone had taken that feeling and tried to make it into a weapon. He was not angry at Yuna. He was not even angry at Tanaka. He was angry at the version of himself that had waited 3 years to be honest, because that silence had cost them both. It had left her in a position she did not ask for and did not deserve, attached to a situation whose danger she had never been told to prepare for. He had protected her from the realities of his world by keeping her at a distance, and that distance had not protected her at all. It had simply left her unaware. He spent the rest of the night making calls. By morning, 3 things had happened. Takeda's intermediary had been traced. The financial consultant Ozawa had been removed from the board with a severance arrangement that communicated very precisely that the alternative was worse. And Ryo Tanaka had received a second communication, this one from Kenji's office directly, this one formal, written, informing him that the Foundation valued his contributions and that any irregularities related to the fabricated funding questions had been fully addressed and that he had nothing to fear. Kenji did not eliminate Takeda. That would have been one kind of story, the obvious kind, the dramatic kind. What he did instead was more surgical and more final. He made a series of moves through legitimate business channels that removed Takeda's operation from 3 critical supplier contracts simultaneously, and then he let it be known, through the specific quiet mechanisms that his world understood perfectly, that the Mori organization was now paying attention. Not threatening. Attending. Watching, which in that world meant the same thing and communicated everything necessary. Takeda retreated. Not immediately, and not without a period of furious recalculation, but he retreated. Kenji arrived at Yuna's apartment the next morning with coffee from the place near her office that she mentioned once, 7 months ago, and that he had remembered without thinking about why he remembered it. She opened the door and looked at the coffee, and then at him. "You remembered," she said. "I remember everything," he said. Which was not a romantic thing to say, technically, but which landed with the full weight of 3 years of precise attention and was more honest than most professions of feeling she had ever received. She let him in. He sat at her kitchen table, an ordinary table with ordinary chairs, the kind of setting so far from the private rooms and formal boardrooms and power-laden restaurant spaces that it felt almost disorienting. And he told her. All of it. The structure of the world she had been operating in, the risks that attached to proximity to him, the reason he had kept distance, the reason the distance had been, ultimately, a kind of cowardice dressed as consideration. She listened the way she listened in meetings, fully without interrupting, saving her responses for when she had processed rather than reacted. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You could have told me this 3 years ago." "Yes. I'm a grown woman, Kenji. I can assess risk. That's actually most of what I do." "I know. So you decided for me," she said. Not with anger, with precision, with the same clarity she brought to budget disputes and program proposals. "You decided I couldn't handle the information, and that's—" She paused. "That's the one thing I need you to understand. I don't need to be protected from the truth. I need to be given enough truth to protect myself." He heard that. He heard it the way he heard things that mattered, fully, without deflection, with the intention of carrying it forward. "You're right," he said simply. "That won't happen again." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're surprisingly easy to say that to," she said finally. "I expected more resistance. I've been wrong before. I know what it looks like. 11 years running an organization this size, and you know what being wrong looks like." "Running an organization this size requires knowing what being wrong looks like," he said. "People who can't recognize it don't last." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Outside her window, the morning was doing what Osaka mornings do, coming in pale and soft and filling the city gradually with the noise of ordinary life recommencing. "What happens now?" she asked. "With Takeda it's handled. Ozawa is gone. Tanaka is protected. The Foundation's operations are unaffected." He paused. "What happens with us is something I'd like to discuss differently from how I've been discussing things for the past 3 years. Meaning directly. Meaning directly." "All right," she said. And there was that quality in her voice, not softness exactly, but a kind of openness that she did not offer casually, the same quality that appeared in her best program proposals when she was asking for something she genuinely believed in. "Then be direct." He looked at her across the ordinary kitchen table. "I would like to know you outside of Tuesday briefings and Foundation events. I would like to have more conversations, like the one we had last night, and fewer years of pretending that your memos don't matter to me in the way they matter to me. I would like to stop calculating the distance between what I feel and what I'm allowed to show." She was quiet. "I'm also aware," he said, "that I'm not an easy person to be close to, that my world has real edges. I'm not offering you something simple. I'm telling you that whatever I offer you, it will be honest, which is, I understand it may not be enough." She looked at him for a long moment that contained many smaller moments. A Tuesday briefing where he asked one careful question that she had answered for an hour. A budget meeting where he had overruled her and she had pushed back, and he had changed his position without making her feel that winning had cost her anything. An evening program last autumn where she had stood in the back of the hall and watched children from a rural school see professional musicians perform for the first time, and she had turned to say something about it to whoever was standing beside her and found him there, standing at the same angle, watching the same moment with the same expression she knew was on her own face. She had not asked herself why he was there. She had simply felt less alone. "I know you're not easy," she said. "I've known that since the first week." She set her coffee cup down. "But I've also known for a while that the difficulty is not the problem. The distance was the problem, and you just walked across it." He breathed, slowly, with the careful quality of someone releasing something they have been holding at considerable internal cost for considerable time. "Yes," he said, "I did. And if you have been watching until this moment, thank you. Stories like this one only continue because of the people who stay until the end. If something in this reached you, leave a comment. We read them, and we will be here with more." The weeks that followed were not a transformation. Kenji did not become someone else. He was still the man who communicated in precise, careful sentences, who kept the interior rooms of himself sparse and defended, who moved through his professional world with the economy of someone who had learned that visibility is vulnerability. None of that changed. What changed was Yuna's access to those interior rooms. It was gradual. An evening walk through the Nakanoshima district that began as a conversation about a potential foundation venue and extended, almost without either of them noticing, into 2 hours of walking and talking about things that had nothing to do with the foundation at all. The first time she heard him laugh with genuine unself-consciousness at a mistake he made in his own recollection of a story, and the way he looked almost startled by the sound of himself, as if he had not heard it recently and was uncertain whether to be pleased or alarmed. The evening he called her, for no professional reason. Simply because he was in her neighborhood and the restaurant on the corner had the kind of menu she had mentioned preferring, and he had made a reservation assuming she would be available, which was both presumptuous and entirely correct, and which she called him out on immediately, and which he acknowledged with the particular non-smile that she had learned meant he was significantly more amused than he appeared. She learned the geography of his silences, which ones were thoughtful, and which were protective, and which were the rare kind that meant he was genuinely uncertain, not calculating, not managing, but actually navigating something in real time. He was a man who had been certain for so long that uncertainty looked different on him than it did on most people. On most people, it looked like anxiety. On him, it looked like attention. And she learned what it meant when he showed up with the right coffee. It was not a declaration. It was not a grand gesture. It was a man who paid attention to the details of her preferences because he had been paying attention for 3 years without permission to act on what he observed. And now that the distance was gone, the attention expressed itself in the only vocabulary he had truly mastered: precision, reliability, presence. She had been loved grandly before, dramatically, by a man who sent enormous arrangements of flowers and forgot her opinions on important matters within 48 hours of hearing them. She understood, standing in her kitchen watching Kenji Mori sit at her ordinary table with his bandaged hand and his careful eyes, that what she was being offered now was entirely different in kind, not louder, deeper. The foundation continued. The textile exhibition traveled in the spring to 3 schools, and the response exceeded every projection, and Yuna stood in a gymnasium in a small town 4 hours outside Osaka and watched students crowd around display cases of fabric traditions that their own grandparents had practiced and had believed no one young cared about anymore, and she cried, briefly, in the corner where she thought no one could see her. Kenji was there. He had come without announcement, the way he had stood at the back of the autumn performance. He did not say anything about the crying. He simply stood beside her in the corner and watched the room with her, and after a moment he said, very quietly, "This is the work," and she understood he meant more than the exhibition. He meant all of it. The 3 years of Tuesday briefings, the memos in the evening, the budget disputes she had won and won again, the work of building something that mattered in a world that mostly moved toward what was profitable. She took his hand. He looked down at their hands and then at her, and something in his face did something it did not often do. It opened slightly like a window that has been painted shut for a long time and has finally been worked free. In a different kind of story, this would be the end. The gesture would be the resolution. The distance collapsed, the feeling named, the future assumed. But the thing about people who have been formed by difficulty is that they carry it differently than other people. Kenji did not forget that his world had edges. Yuna did not pretend they did not exist. What they built instead was something more honest than a fairy tale, a structure that had room in it for the truth of both their natures, his need for control, named and acknowledged, her need for full information, respected and delivered, his difficulty with vulnerability, treated as a work in progress rather than a character flaw to be overcome, her stubbornness, understood by him as the same quality that made her extraordinary, which meant he was not allowed to celebrate it professionally and resent it personally. They argued about the foundation, about boundaries, about the one time he made a decision that affected her work without consulting her, and she arrived at his office at 8 in the morning with the particular energy of someone who has been rehearsing a conversation since 5 and delivered it with total clarity and zero performance. He listened. He did not defend himself until she was finished. He acknowledged the error without the elaborate self-flagellation that some people use as a way of making their mistake about their feelings rather than about the person they affected. She left his office that morning feeling something she had not expected to feel: respected. Not agreed with automatically, respected. There is a difference, and it is enormous, and not everyone who claims to offer it actually understands it. Takeda, 6 months later, made one more attempt. Not at leverage this time, and he had learned that lesson. What he tried instead was a straightforward business maneuver, an attempt to acquire one of the Mori organization's supplier chains through a third-party holding company. It was clever. It was also thoroughly anticipated by Kenji, who had spent the intervening months quietly positioning responses to every probable move Takeda was likely to make after the retreat. The acquisition attempt dissolved before it completed. Cleanly, legally, without confrontation. Takeda understood. He stopped. And life, as life does when the major battles have been resolved, settled into the rhythm of something that required maintenance rather than crisis. The foundation grew. Yuna hired 2 additional program directors and spent 3 months training them in the way she worked, which was rigorous and occasionally terrifying, and produced by every measure exceptional results. Kenji watched this from a respectful distance that was entirely different from the previous distance. This one was intentional, chosen. The space you give someone you trust, rather than the space you maintain because you are afraid of what the closeness will cost. He told her that once, in the middle of an ordinary evening that had no particular occasion attached to it. She looked at him for a moment and said, "I know." And then, "I've known for a while." And then quieter, "I just needed you to know that you knew it too." He understood what she meant. The knowing and the saying are different muscles, and only one of them actually reaches the other person. He was learning. There is a kind of love that announces itself with broken glass and controlled silences, and 3 years of evening memos that were never just about work. It does not look like the love in certain stories. It does not arrive with speeches or music or perfectly timed confessions under rainfall. It arrives in the careful gravity of a man who remembers a coffee order from 7 months ago and shows up with it, without explanation, in a woman who stayed in a city because something unnameable told her the reason was still becoming clear. It is the kind of love that asks something real of both people. Visibility from the one who learned invisibility as a survival strategy. Patience from the one who knows that the other's walls are not indifference, but the scar tissue of a particular kind of survival. A wine glass shattered in a restaurant in Osaka, and the sound of it traveled in the way that pivotal sounds do, far beyond the room it was made in. It reached a woman who had been wondering for 3 years whether she was imagining something. It reached a man who had been maintaining a distance he told himself was protection, and finally understood was loss. It reached an organization, and a threat, and a city, and a small gymnasium in a town far from the city, where children crowded around glass cases full of the things their grandparents made. And in all of it, the dinner, the silence, the coffee, the walk, the argument, the exhibition, the ordinary evenings, 2 people slowly built something out of the ruins of their own restraint. Not perfect, not easy, not without cost, but real and chosen, and entirely, specifically theirs. If this story stayed with you, let us know in the comments. Tell us the part that reached you most, because your responses shape everything we make on this channel. Subscribe if you have not yet, and stay close. The next story is already waiting.